Thank you, Colleen, for your presentation. We will take the time that is left to answer questions. Intentionally, we do have enough time to answer questions. The idea was to have the presentations done and then have you ask as many questions, practical questions, as much as possible so that we can have something to take home. So for now, I will request the first round of questions. You can just take the floor and then you identify yourself, the speaker to whom your question is addressed, if that's possible, and then you ask your question. I'll take the first 4 sets of questions addressed to each of the speakers, if that's possible, and then we'll move to the second round. Now I have the first question from there, and then we move from there. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. MC. And my name is Langlum from the Gambia. My question goes to Caroline, and it has to do with digital ID and the laws that you mentioned. As many countries are actually moving towards digital ID, I think the big question that is always asked is the law, because there are traditional institutions that are already mandated to do the ID system. Now you have a whole different picture now to ID. So how does the UK rather deals with the role of the existing ID management authority, and this and the new office that you mentioned that is created, DIA? And also, if you can give us an example of some of the laws that are actually changed. For example, in terms of, let's say, when digital ID comes, also it plays a role in terms of how people become a national of a particular country, things like such. We want to know what kind of laws you're actually working on to change per se. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a hand in the middle. Yeah, madam.
Oh, thank you. My name is Dr. Emma Otieno from Communications Authority of Kenya. That is the regulator in Kenya. My question goes to Colleen on the issue of the pillars that are critical to the deployment of a digital ID in a government. I got the issue of cloud, but if you could just give us a little bit more, like what are these critical pillars that a government must put in place for effective deployment of a digital ID system? Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I go ahead, or is Caroline going to answer first?
Yes, good morning. I'm Mohammed Jahazeb, Director General Telecom Wireless from the Ministry of IT and Telecom, Government of Pakistan. I have a couple of questions, one from the Caroline and one from Mr. Dwyer. Caroline, I'm a little embarrassed to ask this simple question, but how do you define a digital identity? Will it be my scanned passport, or will I have a e-passport, or will I have another identity document, or will it be the customer defining whether his Gmail or whether his any specific address, mobile number will be the digital identity? So this is my first question. Secondly, with Mr. Dwyer, for the UK security bill, how do you, or how have you balanced the freedom of speech and certain religious and cultural sensitivities in the online safety bill?
Thank you. The last
I hope my question is clear. Caroline, is it?
Yes, I think so. You'll have to tell me if I don't answer correctly.
Thanks.
The last question for the first round.
Thank you so much. My name is Tokozani Chimbe from Malawi Communications Regulatory Authority. I have 2 questions. The last one to the last speaker. And I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that there is need to remove barriers in some legislations that sort of like go counter digital identity. Can you point out some of the legislative barriers that you feel some of the things that needs to be removed. And in the same way, can you please also explain or just outline some of the things that you think you would like to see in legislation that would promote digital identities? And my other question is goes to the presenter who presented on an online safety bill. I just wanted to find out from him what are the enforcement measures that have been put in place in that particular bill to ensure that the owners of platforms really comply with that bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam, for your question. I would request that Colleen Elliott should take the floor first and address all the questions that have been asked to her, and then the other speakers will take the floor after you, Madam. You have the floor.
Thank you. So the building blocks for digital transformation, these are available online. You can find them at www.ps.microsoft.com. There's 8 pillars for digital transformation. The first being a cloud and cloud policy and strategy, as I mentioned. Second is a data classification framework. Third is the adoption and implementation of digital ID. Fourth is a procurement function that is centralized. 5 is the use of government-wide agreements, so a whole-of-government approach. Number 6 is flexible and adaptable financing rules. 7 is a collaborative approach amongst your stakeholders. So you want to think about all the stakeholders in your digital ID ecosystem, whether that's public sector, private sector, tech providers, data providers, etc. And number 8 is digital culture and technology skilling. So again, these are available at our website, www.ps.microsoft.com. You can see the in-depth paper there. But essentially, these building blocks are built on, were formed based off of some research that we conducted globally, speaking with governments around the world around what barriers they were encountering on their digital transformation journeys. And we looked and detailed some of the examples of leading practices that we found as well. So you can find that there.
Okay. I will start. Maybe you can start with your comments on the questions that have been raised. Thank you.
Yes. So the first question that was raised, really interesting, around how the UK government has sought to balance freedom of speech alongside religious and cultural sensitivities. So I think this is something that we've always been particularly conscious that we need to get right. The UK government kind of changed its direction on this last December. It made an announcement around the so-called legal but harmful measures that were in place in respect of adults. So that change was really to ensure that the bill kind of struck that right balance in terms of freedom of expression versus user empowerment. So what we'd expect kind of companies to do, and particularly the largest companies that we know have the greatest kind of reach and most high profile, is to put in place kind of measures to protect freedom of speech and have regard to freedom of speech, but also at the same time put in place measures for users which basically would like to minimize their interaction with certain types of content. An example of that content is content that's kind of abusive or incites hate on the basis of kind of religion, for example. But equally, we want to ensure that, you know, companies are proactively addressing, you know, speech that is illegal and that already has kind of a basis in illegality. And so they are kind of proactively taking steps to address that type of content online, you know, hate speech, and so it's a balance of ensuring illegal content is addressed and it's addressed proactively and effectively, ensuring users have more choice over what they interact with online, but equally ensuring that there is that space for kind of robust and pluralistic debate online, and that, you know, appropriate kind of articles and human rights laws are respected at the same time, but very difficult balance to strike. And then just about enforcement measures. So Ofcom will be given pretty strong enforcement measures, the ability to fine companies up to 10% of their global turnover, for example. And there's really kind of broad-reaching powers for Ofcom to request information from companies around what they're doing in response to the bill and the duties that the bill places on them as well. So I think, you know, Ofcom will be very measured and kind of proportionate in its response, and Ofcom is there to kind of support companies in complying with their responsibilities, but equally we want to ensure that there's enough kind of weight behind that if push comes to shove and, you know, enforcement action is required. There are also provisions in the bill around senior management liability. So there will be aspects of the legislation where senior managers can be held criminally liable if they don't, for example, respond to requests, you know, for information from Ofcom. So we think there's a range of kind of enforcement measures that Ofcom has at its disposal, from the kind of initial requesting information around what companies are doing to kind of harder measures to kind of block access to certain content and kind of disrupt businesses and the way that they create money online. But, you know, Ofcom will be kind of taking a very sensible and proportionate approach, really kind of supporting companies in what they kind of need to do, particularly with a raft of codes of practice that will set out some of the steps that companies can take to comply with their responsibilities. So enforcement action won't be kind of the first port of call, certainly, but it's something that we recognise Ofcom needs appropriate powers if companies are not doing what we would expect them to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Madam, I'll give you the floor to address some of the questions that were raised directly to you, please.
Brilliant, yes. So I'm actually going to take the second question first, because the first and the third question were about the legislation. So what, you know, how do we define a digital identity in the UK? Our definition is simply that it is an electronic representation of who somebody is, which they can use to help them get eligibility for goods and services, or for picking up a parcel from the post office, for opening a bank account, any of those other purposes. So we have this really, really high level definition of what a digital identity is, and we're absolutely not trying to decide now what people are going to end up using in the UK. At the moment, physical documents, people pull out their passport, their driving licence, an electricity bill, a letter from a solicitor or a doctor. All those things are used in a variety of ways in the UK, and this is where it blends into the other questions about law. But we have no law, because we have no organised, centralised identity management system in the UK. We have no law about identity. We have no definition in law about what identity is. We have law about passports and law about all sorts of things, but nothing about identity per se. So it's actually been a real challenge for us to work out how do we create law around this digital identity framework that doesn't set too much in stone, but does create trust and confidence. So in the UK, a digital identity might end up being an electronic equivalent of a passport. I'm sure that'll be very useful when we get to that stage, and that is some work that the Home Office is doing. It might be an app on a phone. There are already those sort of facilities. Other countries might be defining and think it's simpler to define exactly what's needed, but that's not the way that we're going in the UK, because, as I said when I was talking, we want to make sure that we don't set the bar now and then technology keeps developing and comes up with some better ideas, something that's more secure and more private or more inclusive. So all we're doing is saying what good looks like and then letting industry decide what is the clever thing that is going to make people want to use it because it's easy and you know, and they like it. And they can work out how to do it, and it's just there for them, whatever their need is. It might be a QR code or something else. So that's the UK approach. And this then lends itself to the questions about what are we doing in our law and legal barriers. And we scratched our heads a lot about this, and we had to look across, you know, the whole range of UK law. You know, what's already said that relates to identity. For example, in our Licensing Act, which controls the sale of alcohol, at the moment, it says that you have to show a holographic ID, so a little hologram, if you want to buy alcohol in a shop to prove that you're over 18. So, you know, there's a barrier there, and there's all sorts of little things scattered through law, but nothing that prevents us doing something on digital identity which will be enabling and will give the market and individual users that confidence that they need just to get on with building and using digital identities. So our law is going to just enshrine those building blocks I talked about. So it's going to permit the Secretary of State to establish a governance body, our Office for Digital Identities, to create a trust framework of standards, and to set up the certification process so that organisations that are assessed as following the digital identity standards in the trust framework, then they can go onto a secure public register, and they can have and display a secure trust mark so that people will trust them. So that's what we talk about in our legislation, and also about how public authorities, government departments can share information, data that they hold about individuals, with private sector companies for the purposes of proving identity if those individuals have given permission for that data exchange to happen. So that's what's in our legislation. You know, every country will have its own rules depending on how much it wants to mandate what the system looks like, but that's what we're doing.
Thank you, Madam. So the digital ID is therefore the digital representation of your physical, what you are in the physical world. The UK, I understand the UK is extremely careful, but at the same time sufficiently inclusive.
Hope so.
Maybe.
That's the plan.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chiloba, you certainly want to add something before we move to the second set of questions?
I didn't have a specific question, but just to comment on something she mentioned about the UK and the idea that there's no single digital identity system. Interesting enough, there's the same debate we are having back at home. One of the agenda is having a digital ID system for all citizens in Kenya. We've been looking at different examples. One, we were encouraged to look at Estonia. I know they're not in the house. As a country that has gone fully digital when it comes to the ID system. This was another example. India, having been able to register, they said, 1 billion people. But when you look at the legal definition of what a digital ID is, you'll find that Estonia will tell you that India does not have a digital ID system. India will tell you they have a digital ID system. Others say, okay, you're going to have a biometric ID system. But biometric ID system, which in Kenya we partially have that, Estonia will tell you it's not a digital ID system. So I think it's a question that's not just for the UK, but a lot more of us. And it becomes more important when you talk about interoperability in future. So if it's going to work in the UK, how will it work? How will the same work in another jurisdiction? that perhaps define digital ID space slightly different. But then, of course, the presentation by Colleen talking about the pillars, what was curious for me, of course, was the other practical elements of, for example, procurement as a key pillar. That is when you're looking at a solution as a sourcing, from a sourcing perspective. You're going to implement a project on digital ID. But it gets to a point where it stops being a sourcing project. It becomes the way we live. So how do you make sure that this works on a more sustainable basis as opposed to sourcing, procurement, commercialization, this kind of things? And I think most of our governments, the challenge we have is how to deal with vendors in this particular space. Because everyone will come with a solution, but which one do we pick? Yeah, but I think very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you. I have another brother in the hall who used to tell me that the most unimportant question is that which was not asked. I encourage you to ask your questions, especially the practical questions with regards to the presentations that were made, so that you leave here with something. So we're going for the second set of questions, and I already see 2 hands. This is very nice. 3 hands. Very good. So the second question from the colleague, and then the first question that way because the microphone is already that way, and then the third question that way, and the second this way. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. This is Shivendra from Fiji. I just wanted to ask Caroline, in terms of how do you incorporate traditional identification methods in more your civil registry, which is more official? Many of our countries, we do have more traditional identification methods, such as based on where you're from, which lineage do you belong to, your parents, and sometimes when people introduce themselves, they incorporate that in their introduction. So sort of that is a source of identity for them. And I was very curious when you mentioned about the office being set up off there and whether these attributes are also something that you'll be looking at. The other question was, and I think it was also touched upon regarding biometrics. How important is biometrics to cement digital identities to bring in the trust and credibility in the whole ecosystem? Thank you.
There's somebody at that end? Yes, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dick Silwa. I'm from Mauritius. I'm the chairman of the ICTA, which is the equivalent of the Ofcom. I have a question to the panel in regard to the online harm legislation. I think this has been going on in England for the past 3 years, that there was the decision by the Parliament. If I'm not wrong, I think at the time it was Theresa May who was Prime Minister. And by that time we have changed 3 or 4 Prime Ministers in UK, and I wish you good luck. What I can say is that we had a public consultation in Mauritius as well in regard to the online harm, and it hasn't been an easy thing for us because in the public consultation, the public responded very, very much against any sort of regulation of the internet whatsoever. And there were a clear no, and they even said we were trying to put up a dictatorship state, especially for the fact that Mauritius, as you know, is one of the countries, I think we are first in Africa in terms of democracy and 22nd in the world. So I very much would like to follow how England is going to set up this online harm act. That would be very interesting. I have also spoken to your High Commissioner there. I had someone here to come and see me to discuss about this. But that was like 2 years ago. And it would seem to me that there hasn't been much progress. Now you're saying it's maybe in a few months, so I wish you good luck. I have another question in regard to the other issue of digital identification to the panel. Perhaps our friend from Kenya can also help us. For me, I see 2 issues which will come up. The first one would be data protection, and second one, we just talked about it in the earlier panel, is one about cybersecurity. I mean, also there people can think that, you know, with a digital signature, we might be going towards a sort of authoritarian dictatorship, like in some countries they have, you know, everything is controlled. It would be interesting perhaps to compare, because I see for instance, Caroline Copley, you didn't say whether England was the first country to put that into effect, whether other countries already have legislation. I see that perhaps Finland has reached quite far, or Switzerland, or New Zealand, or Australia. I'm not very sure, but we have to see what's going on in other countries which has similar legal system ourselves. I mean, those are real challenge I see, and would be food for thought to discuss here. Thank you.
Okay, see Cameroon raise their hand, please.
Yes, thank you. Hello, I think I can be heard. My main question is to the panel, whoever wants to pick that up. It's about data sovereignty. We will talk a lot about cloud hosting. We can host, which means virtually, if we take the IDs of everybody in one country, they're being hosted in another country. It poses a significant problem of sovereignty. I don't know whether a member of the panel has had to deal with that. Do we then do ID and all of that digitalization and transformation, ensuring that national data stays national? If it stays national, what is the impact on the development of the global market? Thank you.
Thank you, Cameroon, for that question. We'll take the last question. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. The degree of influence some of the digital platforms have gained and continue to gain, I will not be surprised if these digital platforms apply for a United Nations membership 2 or 3 years down the road. So my question to Tim is, or maybe Caroline can also comment based on her experience at the UN, that what if few of those very influential digital platforms refuse to comply with the national legislation, the required compliances. So does the bill has any provision to do if such platforms refuse to comply with the local laws?
Excellent question. This time around, I think we'll start from the floor, then end with Colleen, if she has comments to make online. So I will start with you, Steve.
Thank you. So in response to the first question, yes, obviously this legislation was proposed, as I mentioned, I think back in 2017 under under Theresa May's administration. Obviously we've seen a fair bit of kind of political change. It's a high-profile piece of legislation, and every Prime Minister and indeed Secretary of State wants to ensure that they have their kind of say on the bill as is appropriate. I think added to obviously the kind of political change that we've seen, it is also a very kind of difficult piece of legislation. It's quite novel, even though we are beginning to see other kind of regulation of this kind, particularly in Australia, which is ahead of most. The EU's Digital Services Act as well, for example, it is still novel, and we are still kind of grappling with how to get this right, and to ensure that we're not kind of doing anything that might have unintended consequences online, certainly with regards to the over kind of moderation or removal of content, for example. So I think that's one thing I'd say is that it recognises the difficulty of regulation in this space. But actually, it's interesting what you say about kind of some of the pushback that you've had from the national population in Mauritius. What we're seeing here is now quite broad support for these measures. particularly when it comes to children as well. This is a bill, unlike kind of all legislation, certainly that goes through Parliament, that's really getting support from across all sides of the House. So we are seeing a very broad coalition of support. Obviously, when it comes to civil society, there is a bit of a split in terms of some of the civil kind of liberties groups and some of the groups that aim to protect particularly children and vulnerable groups, and there will always be that split in terms of how they approach the regulation, but certainly we are seeing that very broad base of support overall now. And I think that feeds into a certain extent to what you were saying as well in relation to the second question around how are we going to make sure the platforms actually do what they're supposed to do with this legislation. So as you know, it's going to become a lot more kind of basically unpalatable for the public who do support these measures, for these companies not to kind of comply with their new responsibilities. And I think they recognise they also have a social responsibility. Yes, they don't agree with all aspects of the bill, but they have kind of broadly supported certainly elements of it and what the bill is trying to achieve at a high level. So yes, we've obviously faced, a degree of resistance and a degree of difference in opinion on how best we take forward these measures. But I would really emphasise that kind of broad support that we've seen, even amongst some of the tech platforms. And I would suggest reputationally, it's very damaging for them not to be putting in place measures which are designed in particular to protect children and protect children from harm online. I would again kind of point to some of the enforcement measures that the bill provides for, that are really aimed at kind of driving compliance as a last resort, particularly strong measures around global revenue and being able to fine companies up to 10% of their global revenue. But also, we're putting senior managers in these organisations on the line for these responsibilities. They can be held criminally liable and prosecuted, in the UK, if they're found to be kind of negligent or have not kind of complied with the responsibilities. That only respects, it's worth emphasising that only applies in respect of the child kind of safety duties and contravention of kind of enforcement action in respect of those. That's still a provision that's being worked through, and also in terms of the information gathering powers that Ofcom has. But I'd suggest that's a pretty strong kind of deterrent. And companies are very alive to this. It's been spoken about, as we've touched on, for quite a long time. They know these measures are coming, and will, I think, work kind of constructively with Ofcom as and when issues do arise. We've certainly not had any suggestion that won't be the case. But we also recognise, there will be challenges in how this is implemented. Ofcom will be on certainly a journey. And I think one thing that I have not really touched on is how that we recognise that actually, as a number of countries do decide to legislate in this space, that there will be a kind of, hopefully a growing consensus internationally around how we tackle some of these issues. And the more countries that put in place regulation, the greater the kind of incentive is to drive the bar up kind of internationally and put in place kind of greater standards that apply, across various different jurisdictions. So I think we'd certainly hope that kind of international collaboration will really help in respect of that. So Ofcom and alongside a couple of other regulators, one of them being Australia's e-Safety Commission, Fiji's Online Safety Commission, have established an online safety regulators network. We see that as a very kind of invaluable tool for regulators, but also prospective regulators. They accept applications for observers to really learn from what's going on and some of the regimes that are perhaps at the forefront of this regulation, and to learn from the lessons that they've had in regards to developing it, but also putting it in place. we're looking to, Australia, they've got invaluable kind of lessons for us, certainly with respect to their legislation, and we think that collaboration is really key, actually, in sharing intelligence and acting to kind of drive up standards across basically the sector.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just a comment on data sovereignty?
I don't know if that's entirely one for me. I probably will pass on that one. Thanks.
Okay. Samara, please, to address the concerns.
Hi. So the first speaker asked about, how do you make a digital identity? What should be the components of it? And I would suggest that is a question for governments to take into account, depending on what suits their country. So, for example, in the UK, our addresses, we associate ourselves with an address which has a street name and a number or a house name and a postcode. I know that in some countries, people create a relationship based on the name of their village and who's the chief in that village. And so I think it's important to take into account the country, and all those systems will be valid. The key thing to remember when you build your system is to do it in a way that you can then find the route to aligning with systems in other countries. For example, on how you create a date. The US and the UK have different approaches. They put the month first, we put the day of the month first. So that's a sort of conversation that could be useful to talk about internationally. Just simple things like that. So not trying to create some whole system of mutual recognition where there's a matrix and every country in the world has to do things exactly the same, but simply to build our own national systems to suit our people and our businesses. And think about the building blocks of those national systems and how they can interrelate and align with other countries. So that would be my suggestion on that. In terms of biometrics, the UK approach is that we're setting the standards for how companies should do biometrics well if they want to include biometrics in a digital identity, recognising that biometric features can add to the security. But we're not saying that a digital identity should have biometric features, because that doesn't work for everybody. And sometimes, you might not be recognised by your biometric features. So what we're hoping is that to make digital identities very inclusive in the UK and to suit everybody, that companies will always feel the obligation to put an alternative, an option route in for when things like the biometric features fail. So that's our approach on that. Data protection issues somebody raised and asking whether we're the first country to have legislation. So we do have data protection legislation, which we are in the process of amending at the moment. There's a bill in Parliament, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, and we would not claim in the UK to be the first country to have digital identity legislation. We've mentioned India. There are other countries in the world. There are other countries in the Commonwealth, and there are countries like Estonia that we're all told do it really, really well because they've got everything super streamlined, and aren't we envious? But that's not how we're doing it in the UK, and there are other countries you can look to that have legislation, including countries like New Zealand, Australia and Canada, that are trying to take an approach which is not mandatory and is not based around a single ID card option or digitised ID card option. So hopefully that's helpful. On data sovereignty and this worry that national data needs to stay national, particularly if you're thinking about international interoperability, so sending people with their digital identities into other countries. We're thinking an awful lot about that. That's really important to all of us, isn't it? And our approach in the UK is that we want to have a very open system. So we are not going to prevent any organisation that's registered anywhere in the world from being interested in working within our trusted ecosystem, they will have to be registered in Britain as well, and they will have to go through this robust certification process that can take about 6 months, that really, really tests whether people are going to be managing data and being responsible for people's personal data in a very secure way. So that is our approach to that. It's developing, but we recognise that it's something that everybody is going to feel concerned about, and we want to make sure that we can satisfy those concerns. And then finally, there was a question about what if these big digital platforms just refuse to comply. I mean, we can't, in the UK, we're not trying to stop anybody doing anything. We're not mandating the system. It may be that there is some marvellous platform out there that doesn't want to be part of the trusted UK system. The psychology that we're adopting is that if we have a trusted system in the UK with a trust mark and a secure public register and a clear process and governance, then we're hoping that organisations that want to provide digital identity services in the UK will choose to be part of that, and that individuals will choose to use those trusted systems because they can see they're trusted. But if individuals choose to go with some framework that's not part of our trusted ecosystem, then we're not going to stop them, because that's just not the way that we've decided to operate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Chiloba, maybe?
Yeah, I think to just add what you've said, I think so important when it comes to data sovereignty. An example from my country, 3 years ago, we enacted a new law on data protection. We set up an office of the Data Protection Commissioner. They're just now coming into operation. The last 1.5 years have been busy registering data protection officers. But as that is going on, of course, you look at what's happening in the entire ecosystem, you find that the sector is evolving. And I think it's very difficult to be static in the way of thinking when you're setting up those rules. Currently, for example, we have set our laws based on the GDPR principles. But then most of the investors, the ones who want to attract in our space, are multinational companies who are more concerned about how to access and manage the data within your space. So you cannot have a thriving e-commerce, for example, environment unless you allow some of these multinationals coming into, into your space. So one of the concerns they're having is that our data protection rules are very, very strict, to the extent that it makes it almost impossible for them to invest. You basically have increased the cost of entry. So, and the suggestion that some of them have come up with was to come with this alternative framework. I think they call the CBR, just trying to get the actual, they call it the cross-border privacy rule system, which is a little bit more permissive. So when it comes to data sovereignty, then you have a conflict between your approach to data protection, which is anchored on the GDPR principles, and you have this framework, the cross-border privacy rules, largely driven by the United States and some of the Asian countries. So you're in dilemma in that particular space. The question that you, as a policymaker, you have to ask yourself is, what is it that you want to maximize? Is it investment by the multinationals in your space, or strict enforcement of your data protection rules to the extent that there'll be no new investment coming into that particular space? So for me, I see it as a very dynamic environment. And what governments need to be doing is to be asking the core question, what is it that we want to maximize with this digital transformation agenda? Even at the global level, I see it like we have to, at some point, be opening up these discussions, because the drivers of the economy are going to be in the digital space. But then we cannot govern the same space the way we govern the, the physical normal way of, the physical space. So that, I think, is a challenge. But the more dynamic we are, I think the better for our people. Somebody asked about the biometrics for purpose of digital identity. Like I said, I've listened to different representatives of countries talking about the digital ID. India will give you an example of biometrics as a digital ID system. Estonia will tell you, no, that's not a digital IT system. This is how we describe the digital ICT system. And perhaps Colleen will tell us something else about what they consider as a digital ID system for purposes of their business. So my take is that the countries have to ask themselves, how do they identify their citizens in the digital space for purposes of fulfilling the requirements for a more progressive society when it comes to digital transformation. So how do you want to identify your citizens? My president recently said, it's not the responsibility of government to give you an ID card. However, it's the responsibility of government to identify you and have you represented as who you are. So for those who talk about biometrics, of course, you have to show with your fingerprints and perhaps image to be identified as such. But others will give you a unique identifying number, that becomes your number from childhood all the way until you die, as long as it's accessible in the digital space. So if the responsibility of government is to enable your identification as an individual, then how do we frame our digital ID systems, and it's not just for country specific. Again, it has to cross the borders to other spaces. So that is what I think I can say. It's not, there's no specific answer to it. But I think from a principal point of view, we must be very dynamic, be flexible enough to adopt changes even as they occur. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Colleen, I would like to give you the floor again, so you make your last comments with regards to the private sector way of seeing it and Microsoft. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you. So a number of comments made by the panelists I completely agree with. I wanted to mention the UN recently completed, just back in the fall, model law for cross-border recognition of identities. Thailand was the first country to implement that, and so far the only one that I'm aware of. So if you have not seen that, I strongly recommend looking into that. And that will really, it's designed to give you that basis for what digital ID law, particularly in this global context, cross-border context, could look like. Secondly, I wanted to point to New Zealand as a shining example around identity and how to deal with the matter that was mentioned around, how certain communities define identity. Their indigenous community, Maori people, are very vocal about how they define their identities, and their identity is steeped in the idea of relationship. So I am vouching for my relatives, in fact, of who they are, and that being recognized within that country's context. So I would encourage you to research that as well for some examples of how that has been dealt with in other countries. In terms of biometrics and their role, so when we look at it from a security perspective, and thinking about how to evolve identity technology and identity credentials to be more secure as we move into this digital era and the digital economy grows globally, we have to move towards a model where we have multi-factor authentication. And what that means is you have multiple factors that you can verify or validate to confirm a person's identity. So the three classic areas we talk about are, knowing what they are, who they are, and something they have. So in today's world, it was mentioned around physical ID cards or being assigned an identity number, you know, like a national ID number or something like that. In the past, that was sufficient. But what has happened and why identity technology is evolving is that those factors that existed, what you have and something you have and something that you know, so like a password or identity number, these are being compromised in increasing frequency. So I may share my password with my partner, with my child to access services on my behalf. I may steal someone's national ID number to claim benefits. There was an explosion of that during COVID, for example, because there weren't sufficient digital IDs or technologies available to prevent these types of risks from happening. So now we're adding biometrics as a third factor, something that you are much harder to break, much harder to steal. Now, what happens is you have to have the wraparound security if you're going to use biometrics. So it's not a sense of let's create this honeypot, this database of biometric information and not have it adequately protected. And protection for us means strong encryption, leading technology to protect and secure that database. So it's not enough to just employ biometrics. Those can become vulnerable as technology advances and as bad actors also advance in their practices. So be thinking about securing that as well. The next thing I wanted to mention was around the online hubs and you know, the mention around public consultation. So it was mentioned in my bio. I spent 15 years in the government prior to joining Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft for the last 2 years. You're absolutely going down the right path by doing public consultation. Digital ID is not something, you know, we want to force down the throats of the public. They have to be ready, they have to be skilled, and they have to be educated. And if your public is telling you that it's something that they don't want, there are other approaches that you can look at. You know, physical cards are becoming stronger and stronger. That technology is also evolving. So you can look at having chipped cards, e-enabled physical cards, and how those can be leveraged to slowly bring your population along. One of the things that has worked as well is welcoming the population, the citizenry, into the process of doing pilots and testing so that they understand better how the technology works and how they're better protected by using digital IDs. So these are some of the practices that I used here in Canada. We did extensive user research as well as working and co-creating with the public. And I say co-creation intentionally because that really is what being digital is about. It's about working together. It's about being user-driven. So you absolutely have to go with where your citizenry is, and you're taking the absolute right approach to take that step back and really look at that. So data sovereignty, this is a massive topic, but I'm going to try to summarize this as quickly as I possibly can. There's really no one size fits all solution for data sovereignty. So what we've encountered, and we encounter this topic quite a lot at Microsoft, being a global company. Some countries, there's a desire to have the data remain resident within that country's borders. This is often a very costly and complex requirement, not only for technology providers, but also for governments. How we're addressing that is we're trying to ensure we are opening up additional cloud regions, making sure we have data centers available as close to as many countries as possible. So we're expanding our data center footprint globally to support that need. What we often recommend is there needs to be a comprehensive documentation and exploration of what data countries are considering or thinking needs to be resident within their borders. often when you peel back those layers and you start to have that discussion around what needs to be resident, what needs to stay within the borders, then the solutions start to arise. Whether you're looking at hybrid cloud architecture, whether you're controlling the access, who has access and for what purposes. And it's also important to clarify what data, but also how that data is being used. Is it data that's in transit? Is it data that's at rest? So this is quite a complex and nuanced topic. So I really encourage you to not look at it in general terms or talk about it in general terms in terms of data sovereignty. All data does not need to be sovereign, but there are legitimate concerns that countries have around how their data becomes used and secured as it's being used. So definitely just undertake the risk-based analysis so you understand, and make sure that data can be lawfully accessed and is also secured. We've done some work in this area, and I want to thank the panelist from Kenya for what he's mentioned around the cross-border privacy rules framework. We've done similar agreements. We have a transatlantic data privacy framework between the US and the EU. We now have the EU data boundary. So, the EU is a collection of multiple countries, right? So they're attacking it from a regional perspective because that's what works best for them. It's not something that in practical terms, platform companies like Microsoft are going to be able to address always at a country level. And as I mentioned, that would be very costly. So in order to maintain that, the efficiency that comes with cloud and hyperscale, we really it has to be a two-way conversation. Technology providers have to meet the needs of their customers, in this case, government, or their technology will not be adopted. Government has to understand how technology is evolving, or else they create rules and policies and regulations that quickly become outdated. So I hope that theme is becoming clear to us all throughout this conversation, that it's really a collaboration that has to happen hand in hand. It's not up to tech providers to dictate where technology goes. It has to meet the need of our target users, such as government, and government has to understand where the tech is going so they set the right rules and the right conditions for investment, as mentioned. So as I said, very detailed, very in-depth topic. I'm happy to share more resources on this. I have colleagues who are experts in this space, and we have an exhaustive list of documents about all the steps that Microsoft is taking around data sovereignty and how we're tackling this issue. So you can reach out to me via LinkedIn or through CTO. I'm happy to share more information.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you for your answers and to the way you've presented them exclusively. I would now like, before I make my closing remarks, I'd like the Secretary General of the CTO maybe to make a comment or two before we close. Thank you, Madam. Please, the microphone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Master of Ceremonies. This has been a very enlightening morning, and I think there is sufficient information that came out of the session that would actually help us craft some sort of program going forward to assist the members of the CTO. So I'd like to thank the panelists and the keynote speaker for their really, really insightful presentation. I think the information is priceless. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is that need for collaboration. It is essential. Our world is a different place. You cannot exist in isolation. You have to collaborate with your fellow, your neighbors, and what I have found is when you sit at the table and you share the ideas, you challenge each other, the solution is going to be superior. So I thank you all for the time. I think it's been excellent. I don't know if I'm taking your role, but I'd like to congratulate all the presenters today. Please join me in congratulating them on a really informative session. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam. It's been a very informative session. Thank you. Thank you for the presentations, and thank you for the questions that you have asked. It's been very enriching, and as I promised you in the morning, it seemed to be the case, at least to me. I enjoyed every minute of it. I enjoyed every presentation. The challenges are there. Whenever there are risks, that means there are opportunities and there are threats. And whenever there are threats, it means there is something to be done. And that is why the private sector has a very big role to play. The conclusions that we're leaving this hall with, is that we have to go for an open, more inclusive approach to it, including everybody and taking everybody on platform. And this is the way the CTO had approached the whole thing from the start. And I keep reminding us, Madam already made the clear path. What can the CTO do to help under these situations where we're looking into the future and we see in the future it seems bleak, but at the same time, several opportunities are being presented. And I think it's the right time for us to grasp those opportunities and do something about it. Thank you very much. We've come to the close of this morning's session. We are maybe 5-10 minutes late, but I do apologize and I take responsibility for everything. Thank you very much. We will do a short break, which is the networking launch. Maybe, Robert, you could enlighten us a bit on this. Thank you very much. Just a few minutes.